Hello everyone, today we talk about the 13th century German warrior bishop for our historical military units series. It's not the first time we really cover, of course, medieval knightly panoply, but as you can understand, like this ecclesiastical cut here is something new. It doesn't necessarily identify the Middle Ages as such, right, but a specific military historical culture within it that we have already, say, laid the background for in other videos, especially the one talking about the feudalization of the episcopal investitures in Germany after the Concordat of Worms of 1122, as we will understand now, and as you can already imagine, like this is a process that pushed forward the already military nature that actually some bishops had already had, and especially in regions like Germany, albeit the episcopal practice of leading his men at least up to the frontier was already something that the very prelates were called to do since Carolingian times. It had already, there is a prehistory to that too that is often not discussed, and there are many other, not just historical figures, like, for example, although Bishop of Bayeux, Hastings in 1066, Philip of Dreux, Bishop of Beauvais at the Battle of Bouvines, Guglielmino de Lubertini at the Battle of Campaldino, Egidio Bornoz at the Battle of Rio Salato that we have also looked at, right, that the guy would become a cardinal later on. But a veritable military system that, as you can understand from the geographical context of the aforementioned examples, literally all over Western Europe, really brought, in fact, in this region, to the regular participation of some bishops in war, right, in combat even. There is that legend that says that bishops went at war with maces, warhammers, because they didn't have to thrust or cut to spill blood. That's actually just a myth, right? There was something to it, of course, like blood spilling we talked about from on the evidence of the medieval penitentials. How actually cared about was this issue of sin and blood spilling, also for regular knights. You can understand for priests that should have been like at a more detached, at least from the material and pure side of the story. Albeit we should talk about that too, how important blood had been in the, for example, the establishment of what mostly where this militarization of the episcopate of the bishops had come from, right? That is the Frankish, the Merovingian legacy, so also the Carolingian one, for, again, many reasons that they pertain mostly to the Gallo-Roman Germanic context, but that eventually fit this broader area of Europe, right? Because the concept is not that bishops, again, were normally going at war. Most bishops were men of peace. They actually had power and retinues. There were many abbots too that had large retinues. It seems like that at the peak of its power, and just talking about Germany that we'll focus on today, of course, the abbot of Fulda had apparently 20,000 armed men at his service. It's not even just about the German bishops by themselves were more peaceful bishops, but of course this country had undergone a degree of privatization and feudalization, and also especially at this point a degree of public decline and detachment of the episcopal allegiance to the imperial authority, which is something new, right? Because more or less in all the various European kingdoms, like the church had always backed like royal power, because in fact the prelates were less militarized than the secular knights, and that instead at this point, and because of the consequences that, as we've seen, followed, like essentially the German defeat in the investiture controversy, mirror in fact that level of essentially of equation almost in lifestyle between the temporal and spiritual powers that of course were also overlapping to a degree. Just it is a metaphysical reality rather than a matter of opinion, right? And there is also a history of episcopal political and territorial control that entails the use of milites that were really necessary, especially as secular men, for the bishop to enforce a certain degree of deterrence, of authority, of violence. In fact, as we've seen in our videos about the Ministeriales and the German bishops, the sense is that the clergy needed some advocates that could in fact comminate death penalty, which was normally not a faculty provided. It was not a faculty at all, right? Provided to the clergy. And so it would be actually much more to say, because it's easy to make the meme of the militarized medieval bishop. Look how the Middle Ages were. It's actually way more complicated than that. And again, the reason why Germany is also the country that stands out the most is this ancestral, right, habituation to, say, a militarization of the clergy, both for example, in the High Middle Ages, the degree of, say, of Christianization that the country underwent, the kind of enemies that were at the gates, the fact that, think about, after the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, priests had become de facto spies that were checking on the fealty of the local population to the imperial authority. And finally, after 1122, like the collapse of a specific level, right, again, of public development, and so sort of statehood, that essentially equated the bishops to other vassals, not just with the reiteration of the expected provision of troops, right, that the prelates had to summon. It was already something going on before. But in this sense, like, their more direct involvement, especially as far as, in fact, the literal investiture of the beneficia were concerned. And so the fact that this loyalty had to be honored in a different way, in a different context than merely a civil or spiritual one, right, than in other countries. It would bring to some important differences. Everybody knows of the anecdote of Richard of Cornwall. We made a video about him during the Great Interregnum. We are specifically in 1257, when he wrote, in virtue of King of the Romans, to his brother, King Henry III of England, about the, quote, meddlesome and warlike archbishops that are in Germany. And the fact that it would be a fine thing for the same English monarch to create such archbishops in England. Now, this is fascinating because, of course, here we are exactly in that moment of greater disgregation of the German monarchy and statehood more than else. And so a moment in which public rights were usurped, like the same bishops were on their own. They had to defend themselves, to militarize further, and participating to essentially the establishment of what we call historiographically as princely Germany, and witnessing through this latter that evidently England was a tidier country in which bishops were not that warlike habitually. This may be because of the greater grip of the monarchy and this sort of smaller, compact, sort of tidily administered country at this point in history. And it's in fact significant that in the same Battle of Bouvines, I've said before, it could be like, in a fully French context, a warrior bishop. Right, we've seen it also within the Italian city-states in Spain. They weren't really the norm. This is important to stress. But of course, in these countries, the different degree of either of individual power or, again, also of political fragmentation could make such militarization among the episcopate. And this is something, again, that we will look at in detail, aside from this video, for each of these countries, because the story behind it is, in fact, a bit underappreciated, and this kind of video shouldn't be just like, oh, look, the weird thing from the Middle Ages. Let's understand what the Middle Ages were, why this was going on, and how actually normal the thing was, right? This, of course, goes far beyond any sense of, but I read that, Jesus says to turn the other cheeks, and this is unfortunately like the kind of level that most people stop to in any knowledge of religion in an actually righteous sense, why violence, of course, is a God-given instrument that must be used, of course, extremely carefully, but still for higher purposes that can absolutely entail it, right? Murdering is different from killing, and the medievals, as we were saying before, were actually extremely aware, especially in a very militarized world in which, many more people than, say, I don't know, even in Frederick the Great's Prussia in the 18th century would, say, regularly in comparison get into some sort of, not just, say, violent situation, but proper warfare, and that, in fact, is such a different psychological landscape to even appreciate or picture in relation also to this political and cultural development. We know of warrior bishops in countries like Scotland and Hungary as well, but we concentrate on Germany because here they were more numerous. Right. After Worms, we also get sort of better documentation in general. So we can see how all German bishops, princes, at least at that point, because this is also the divide of the realm, expected to serve in person when summoned to provide troops. This is because, in part, also their individual power was actually increasing. And again, they had to maintain their own seigneuries and ecclesiastical properties. And this was, especially in Germany, like just a little more than formal confirmation of a state of affairs that existed since the 10th century. And by the late 12th, it was claimed that nearly all German bishops were, if not soldiers, at least politicians or both, because they essentially lived in an environment that made them effectively leaders of principalities that had to be ruled, so through deterrence, if anything, right? So the picture I'm using today is derived from a late 13th century Swabian manuscript. It's interesting because recently we made a video about Alsace, and there is a video about medieval Swabia. And remember that here we are past the Hohenstaufen, at least chronologically regarding the manuscript. Otherwise, we could, of course, find, as you'll explain now, many of these bishops actually not just in the 13th but in the 12th century as making actually the most of the imperial contingents, especially the ones fighting in Italy, for the simple reason that, as we said before, as long as the German monarchy had been strong and effective, the church obviously had sided with it, and providing, say, first of all, fostering knights, mostly Ministeriales, and we'll say now special assets deputed to their maintenance, their training, their armament, etc., was the best way for the ecclesiastical princes in Germany to maintain their own autonomy politically. And they were, even at the peak of Swabian power, of course, very much threatened in many ways. Actually, the great feud between Frederick Barbarossa and his cousin Henry the Lion was triggered by, not much by the, how it was said, like Henry Lyon wanted to be a sort of an alter rex, or it's just such a threat to Swabian power. There were some spheres of influence that had been established since the time of Frederick's rise, actually as a pacification between the Welfen and the Hohenstaufen. But because Henry the Lion was infesting the northeastern boundaries of the Rhineland bishoprics that had also used to live pretty much, autonomously out there. And however, in this sort of decentralized, rich, fragmented, and decentralized areas, like they were essentially just a very nice prey for the quite powerful Duke of Saxony and Bavaria. The late 13th century is quite interesting, as we were noticing, like also in the other videos. At this point, Swabia was actually fragmenting. The Habsburgs, however, had maintained part of their control in their ancestral lands. Also, the Swiss confederates are appearing. The knightly arms and armor, we will talk more in depth about them along the way, had developed now, especially from Germany's heavier plate armor, especially protecting the torso. The great helm also, at this point, like double-handed, like in the very end at least of the 13th century, double-handed swords were also used, in fact, to smash the joints, damage significantly this new plate armor. It was really bringing, say, the panoply, say the men-at-arms panoply to the next level that we will know in that sort of more, in fact, not commonly knightly fashion, but truly the one of the elite of the post, like peak of the great medieval civilization. Which also means that a German warrior bishop would have pretty much worn the same elite panoply available to his secular counterparts. Here we see like full mail armor, surcoat, gilded helm worn under a mitre crest, could be made of very light materials, mesh papers, something barely heavier. We'll talk more about this general symbolism in, say, in a heraldic sense. Obviously, the mitre explains it by itself. And when we look at the arms, these comprise the usual knightly combination of sword, lance, and shield. Perhaps a side weapon that is not that often shown. Actually, at this point, we talked about it also in the video about the panoply of Ottokar II of Bohemia, is more or less around this time. This guy could be, I don't know, speaking of Swabian Alsace that we discussed just recently, the Bishop of Strasbourg, Walter von Geroldsek, right, who died in 1263. And the sense was that there were lots of that these guys would first of all go at war with spare horses, but also spare weapons that could be attached to the saddle, and could be entire swords, right? Arming swords, plus sometimes, I don't know, axes, maybe daggers, that was at this point like the necessity of sort of getting closer, almost in a wrestling fashion, to such heavily armored opponents, to try to stab them in the joints of the armor, like the weak points, but also crossbows, right? This is sort of very underrated aspect of knightly warfare. Actually, their secondary weapons could be missile. In any case, these guys all hunted for sport, so they perfectly knew how to use a bow from horseback. And the crossbow was a quite effective side weapon. Probably knights wouldn't publicize this very much. It was all an ideal of chivalry. That is not even just a matter of like, okay, we shouldn't do it, it would be stigmatized for it. At least we don't have, unfortunately, that direct, say, deeper level of documentation of what the average knight would say or think. They actually believed much in these ideals, but warfare is something more technically complicated one thinks. It's not even just about, of course, great pitched battles in which like this battle lines of knights would clash frontally, this long lines, just like in a tournament. There was a lot of siege warfare. So of course these guys, including bishops, were trained to use every single kind of weapon available, the best way possible, by the way, because knights did this or their lifelong, aside from the personal, inclination of these prelates, more or less to actual combat and engaging directly into it. Like if we equate them to other knights as they literally were, without any difference that can be spotted, well, they knew that how to use them too. And there isn't really like too much to say. Like this is not a video aiming at, like, say, talking specifically about, say, a type of evidence or another. Just pointing out the fact that next to those sort of more characteristic sources for the development of arms and armor that we have already been looking at in other videos about knightly panoply. There's an entire playlist attached to this. These guys were bishops, right? And so they have this minimal characterization at the base of the mitre. What we can look at rather is the level of episcopal contribution and participation to the imperial expeditions, because these are sort of also better recorded to an extent. The Raumfahrt, the Raumzug, were sort of big event, and as we were saying before, the bishops would be tendentially the most responsive among the German princes, and not even all of them, actually, not all the bishops, however, to the imperial call, right? An individual prince in this time in Germany could easily raise several hundred knights, right? Germany is a very feudal country, right? Doesn't have very strong, say, communal phenomenon that either the count or the bishop are outside of the town that they control the surrounding territory. There are instances, as we've seen even with Cologne, having a very strong, being the larger city in Germany, having a strong commercial development, managing to oust the bishop that, however, maintained the Archbishop of Cologne was the most important in all the empire, actually, at least in all Germany, in terms of like the institutional role that he covered. That, however, in fact, maintained a massive princely estate all along the Rhine and around the city. And of course, at that point, it's not just like he couldn't enter Cologne, but if he wanted to do so, he had to ask the burghers. Well, in this case, the Archbishop of Cologne, for example, could field 500 knights. We're talking 1161. The majority of these knights were Ministeriales. 500 knights is a lot, right? For especially the 12th century, in a time that, up to literally a few, like the last generation, even mounted combat was something that of course was prominent, but even maybe royal armies would dismount to fight, also sort of exploiting the still pretty heavily forested and swampy German terrain. At this point, we see, like under Frederick Barbarossa, probably the Western Frankish model being imported in Germany, being there like literally a boom, a level of reclamation, deforestation, and the princely chivalric character, also the main prelates, is very much evident. And the 500 knights is definitely a might to be reckoned with. And the reason why the word ministeriales, as we've seen, is a bit complicated. It's actually associated, say, at least we want to explain why, in perspective, this happened in Germany, why this military, say, this knightly class of non-freemen was so successful, is, however, a bit the same reason why the German bishops were so militarized in turn, right? Essentially, there were people of lower status that had been conveniently employed, like in a scarcely developed social say environment, in order to like perform certain duties for the nobility, that would foster them as knights, so that they could endow them with some important castles, possessions, etc. But they couldn't inherit. They were essentially dependent as non-freemen on their lords. They couldn't simply betray them. And in fact, were very loyal individuals, especially in southern Germany. It's been estimated that nearly almost the totality of knights were Ministeriales by the end of the 13th century, except at that point they had become literally knights, like in any other ways. It's essentially in the 14th century that free status was basically disappeared, like they were equated to all the other knights. And at this point, some Ministeriales were way more powerful than many noblemen themselves. And in the Episcopal estates, there was plenty of these guys. Also considering that these estates were, of course, as ecclesiastical ones, particularly protected. There were lots of exemptions of the prerogatives that the bishops owned, and they could essentially create their own armies in this case. So when you look at the major, consider that here we're looking at mostly like an archbishop like the one of Cologne, especially the Rhine. Episcopates were the more powerful ones, and they were this more developed area of Germany. And they were also very much connected with the Swabian power at this point, so it was all one with it from Trier, from Mainz, to send contingents to Italy through Swabia, and essentially cultivating this autonomy of the Rhineland under mostly episcopal power, not entirely, of course, backing their Swabian protectors in the process. So again, this allowed them not to be aggressed by other princes. That's the reason, again, why this non-free knights and more militarized bishop, because in other countries, like as we've seen in England, for example, like the social hierarchy, like the political order was sort of much better outlined, at least on the basis of the traditional estates, right? Germany had a much more tumultuous history, and it had sort of mixed wars a bit. So other than for the king's expedition to Rome to be crowned, the Expeditio Italica in Latin, after 1135 called the Expeditio Romana specifically, aside from the Romfahrt, the Romzug in German, only the princes of the church, so literally the abbots, this is not just about bishops, it's also about abbots, and archbishops, were actually obliged to render him military service, right? Since they alone owed their positions to the crown, having been invested, remember, with their various estates and offices primarily by the king. This is how the investiture controversy had ended. Basically, in Italy, were invested first by the papacy and then recognized by the emperor, whereas in Germany was essentially the opposite, even though it did work differently and still depended on the single investiture to a degree. And this connection again between the German prelates and the German king was very strong, right? Was understood truly in feudal terms, and in this sense, in more ones of militaristic ones, almost like, say, not war bandsmen, but say Germany had maintained a bit of that sort of migration era ethos, that there were still dracones as used as banners up to the very 13th century. And so the idea is that, of course, it was a very strong bond of fealty, and that got down to the actual imperium and the military force that was entailed in this private, but at the same time, public relations. These were the most powerful institutions of the country, as we've seen. In order to mobilize other vassals, I don't know, in northeastern Germany, the emperors basically gave up, and they asked just for money, right, and not for knights, because those didn't really want to send them into Italy. which also obviously entailed that in order to provide that military service, the bishop had been invested not just with, his title and the actual, say, pertenances of the church, but the various estates and offices necessary to maintain these military forces. Therefore, it was on the bishops that the rulers relied predominantly for troops. Right? They knew that the bishops themselves, a bit like the Ministeriales, could not simply inherit, like they couldn't pass it to their children. They couldn't sort of privatize the system, or at least the system was also importantly private, as we've seen, because they were conferred just like fiefdoms, like a secular vassal would do. But of course, they couldn't simply inherit personally. Like they had just an office, and in addition to this, after Worms, you had the officialization of the beneficium in this sort of otherwise, in fact, secular relation between the king and the same bishop. This is the very important aspect of the story. In 1167, 1174, and 1176, these were years also of important battles in Italy, like Carcano and Legnano. The German armies operating in Lombardy, in fact, under Frederick I, consisted almost entirely of church contingents and ministeriales as well. However, the obligations of ecclesiastical princes differed from those of the feudal vassals as well. This was, for example, the case when you consider that they were administering an imperial estate, and when necessary financing contingent troops from the proceeds. And sometimes the latter were inadequate to pay for the requisite troops. Thus it was not uncommon for the church to have to mortgage or pawn property in estates in order to raise men, right? The princely ecclesiastical estates were quite powerful. They were in many ways like provided with this core of also military potential, but they weren't as a whole like fully militarized spaces, and approaching the level of the secular princes. Thus, it was also like a more coordinated form of organization and recruitment with imperial authority than simply just like a personal, private episcopal mean, which, however, could be invested into this as well. I mean, needless to say, the bishops came from very powerful secular families themselves, right? And they were also, in fact, playing that game. And throughout the 13th century, things, as we were saying, began to accelerate ever more into that direction. Right. And it was said for this reason that most German bishops were, however, soldiers, if not first, but let's say next to churchmen. It is indeed true that some bishops even commanded imperial armies, as we will see now. We'll make some example of, say, armies led by bishops, but also in sort of more tumultuous situations. And despite the fact that for most of this era there was also a bitter enmity between the empire and the papacy because of the obvious reason that not all bishops were necessarily with the papacy, and at least at this point in history, of course, there were lots of excommunications at Similia, but as we were saying before, there was also like an inherent German logic for which, again, like, the emperors passed, let's say also the opportunities presented by this communication could be important, but say the German affairs remained, and so the Holy Roman Emperors weren't always in Italy. There were other issues to take care of at home. And this wouldn't, of course, bring much problem to those bishops that wanted supported the emperor, even if he was excommunicated and whatever. And so you understand that there is a sovereign subject bond and a political, like also ecclesiastical one, that must be contextualized every time, right? And naturally, as we've seen in some videos, I made multiple videos actually about, actually there is a real playlist called Medieval Bishops in the that I've made, which exemplifies especially like the German episcopal comital feuds that were quite common, and we've seen there how actually violent there were. We talked about especially the Hirschberg-Eichstätt war that took place exactly between 1225 and 1245. The disputes between Eichstätt, Hohentrödingen, Greisbach, Hirschberg are all very exemplificative of, say, the reasons why a bishop could simply go out for reasons that were in fact very feudal, right, private in nature, and were also threatening to destabilize, in fact, the region as a consequence. Also, rulers had to intervene. We talk also about the 14th century, which is a slightly different period from one covered here, but also not that far away. That disintegration again of especially the Episcopal Imperial connection is taking place since the beginning of the 13th century. We looked at the behavior, for example, of Adolf of Altena. It was really, I think, the first instance of this kind during the clashes between Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick, right? So there you see for the first time this Rhineland bishops essentially beginning to side, if anything, like to their own interest rather than else, right? It is true that some of them would be truly militarized. However, it was probably a taste for war. Their lifestyle was just very princely, and as such, like princes fought in the first place. They had all these men at their following, and they were heavily invested politically. So it was kind of obvious, regardless of, say, moral issues, whichever they would have been felt, to invest themselves into actual wars, even in combat, right? There were some German bishops definitely leaving for war. Regarding other expeditions, for example, we have the Archbishop of Mainz that commanded the Brabançon mercenaries in Italy in 1174-75. Interestingly enough, this is just before Legnano. We talked about the Archbishop Christian of Mainz in that video about Conrad of Montferrat. We've seen how important his action was in the Ghibelline field, also, if I'm not wrong, in that video about medieval Pisa. So these were, all-round men of war, really. They had a hell of a military, equestrian tradition. They were commanders. Again, this is really normal. Also in Italy, as we've seen this happen, in France and Spain. This is probably also maybe the century in which this phenomenon reaches its peak. It's also fascinating that Christian of Mainz would, in this time in history, command some Brabançon mercenaries that were often heretics, right? At least among them were many of those in a moment in which actually Western Christendom was getting heavily destabilized. But it's a bit like, I don't know, the Lutheran Landsknechts at Charles V's service that sacked Rome, actually, not doing worse than the Catholic Spaniards behaved like on that occasion. Because, hey, like this is especially a moment of increasing monetization of warfare. There's also this mercenary, presence, shows the Brabançonen were active also in Germany, of course, in Saxony. In 1179, the Archbishop Philip von Heinsberg of Cologne fielded as many as 4,000 mercenaries, cavalry and infantry together, of whom the Brabançons constituted the latter, right? And remember that heretical inclination was also, as you know, married with specific social instances of in fact, aristocratic rule, as we were saying before, just like during the Reformation, you would find this sort of lower estates just like exploiting the situation, say the turmoil, just to hope to attack the authority, actually being brought down. And Germany is actually one of the best examples of how things wouldn't change at all for them. But think about it, because the Brabançons, in that sense, we'll make more videos about them, both as a phenomenon and their tactical skill. Their armament was very much anti-cavalry, right? So it was almost sort of protest. There were people who were habituated even to face those guys, like in a moment in which the mounted arm was really asserting his dominance actually on the battlefield. But in parallel, as we know, infantry was developing, not making it, especially in the 13th century, to achieve anything particularly relevant against cavalry. That was the dominant arm, right, for 150 years until Kortreg. But that contained, especially these Flemish mercenaries, that sense of anti-order to some extent, and they used, as you know, to roam around as freebooters, places like in France where there were plenty of heretics that would support them in that sense, and at least engaging those shady deals, and sometimes even killing bishops, killing noblemen, and also in much more, doesn't make any sense in medieval times to distinguish a civilian or a military context, but we're not talking necessarily about those bishops in arms, or maybe also, but most of these were just murders and slaughters of unarmed people. But reflect on that, because being a man of God and a man of war in this time in history, with all the tensions between the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, this very strongly, this major scale that warfare has actually taken on over the centuries, peaking at this time, and the prestige that even just for a bishop really was manifest in fighting on horseback with this full panoply that we've seen, and charging, etc. What was a major deal, traditionally wise, spiritually, politically, and so you would of course see this man involved heavily in imperial cause and or just in, say, very secular politics at a local lower level. And there are some examples of this, at least different examples of German warrior episcopal involvement. Probably the most notable battle in 13th century Germany involving a bishop is the one of Worringen, fought on June the 5th, 1288. Right, this battle was fought on the Rhine, north of Cologne, and it basically, we've seen it while talking about the Duchy of Brabant, because this involved this rivalry for the between John I of Brabant and the Count Henry of Luxembourg and the Archbishop Siegfried von Westerburg of Cologne on the other side, over the succession for the county of Limburg, right? And the battle is quite interesting because it's essentially the most important display of infantry power in 13th century German warfare. We can argue, in, say, medieval Germany, speaking of the greater development of infantry at this point on the continent. And we will surely make a video on this battle only. And to make the long story short, as far as the bishop is concerned, he was captured and participated heavily in combat, bringing actually some the most important contributions to the battle. Even if this is not Germany still, we're talking about the Aussiedlung and German colonization of the Baltic. The Battle of the Lake Peipus, the ice slaughter, on April the 5th, 1242. Everybody knows the sort of the Soviet era Eisenstein's classic sort of movie with the Teutonic Knights with sort of buckets on their head, but it's very beautiful actually, and it has all a history behind it aside from of course the obscene communistic context. Now there is just a hint here just to show you also how in this corner of Europe bishops contributed militarily speaking. An estimate calculating that the Bishop of Dorpat supplied 300 knights and about 1,000 Estonians. So these were essentially, the latter were auxiliaries, that in fact would also be witnessed at this point in history deployed on the wings of the knights in a Teutonic context. This is interesting. It's another battle, not the one of the Lake Peipus. I will talk more about this. I made a video about the Baltic Crusade tactics that sort of explains that. It's quite interesting because you can see these German crusaders, German knights, German colonists being actually few, seeing relative terms to what they would have been in Germany, compared to the rest of the troops numerically, because there was a very scarce surplus in the Baltic, and as such, even though this made the local footmen that were, especially in Estonia, practically almost all that existed in terms of arms choices, more important, like let's say infantry would be more relied upon, and the more sort of evident macroscopic way to employ it was on the flanks of formation. There's nothing to do here specifically with bishops, but you gotta understand how these would be involved also in this interesting tactical scenarios in which they had to make the most with what they had. The Baltic towns, also on the coast, weren't particularly strong. Again, talking about the Baltic countries, not specifically just like the Baltic cities of Germany proper, like Lübeck, and these were large ones. But the means were precarious. I made a video also on the history of medieval Estonia, and we have to talk more about the Baltic Crusades in general. But just for saying, it was there all an ethos, like at the limits of the world were, I don't know if the Teutonic Knights playing the organ and singing Marian hymns, how this could sort of spirit the troops. And so how even in, say, a more familiarly German context back at home, the presence of bishops, of course, had an important spiritual relevance in the broader political context. This is difficult to digress on in a video especially dedicated to just the sort of military technicalities. But there was, of course, like a very serious implication of a bishop going to battle in the first place. So that even if it was relatively common in a country like Germany, that the military implications were just irrelevant in a sense. It must have been a reason why God had wanted these men on the field. Their action was seen as still within properly the pastoral idea of the war. I mean, going to war with your people, with your herd, right? It has something with it. And just writing an article actually about one of these battles involving say, a bishop in combat. It was actually altered by a later 14th century account, at least in the general narrative, compared from to the early 14th century sources of this battle fought at the end of the 13th century. That, say, not in fact such a tremendously long time later, was seeing like this episcopal participation as some sort of deal, like this guy actually feeling responsible for his men, and even when the battle was lost, like going with them into the fray and dying. Right? There is, and these bishops did die in these battles as well. Like, so it's kind of, and again, it didn't happen so frequently. Like, it wasn't. I wouldn't like to leave you with the idea here that, in fact, it was simply and completely normal to see bishops regularly fighting everywhere as it were nothing. It wasn't really like this. Here we're just talking about a higher level militarization of the episcopate, rather than something so truly unusual about what this guy's lifestyle had to be about. Also because, especially as long as some, say, higher royal imperial authority existed, which of course would also always to a degree be, like you couldn't simply go out there as a bishop and do whatever you wanted for no reason. There must be specific sort of political, feudal reasons why you would engage yourself into an actual combat. And at least if we're talking about the bigger engagements, then at the local level, again, we find more feuds involving bishops that probably also had a greater significance as far as the local relevance of this man, right, of church, like, would be, just as the local secular lords would, in a sense, because bishops were in many ways this also equivalent of secular rulers for the local communities that were proud to support them and assist them, also because they were bishops and they were in this sense thought to have some extra, say, spiritual force on their side. There is that video I always like to remember, by being very old, about Gérald de Aurillac by Olive Cluny. It's a biography of this essentially warrior saint in 10th century Auvergne, that 9th, 10th century post-Carolingian Europe, that was identified as a symbol of, in fact, secular holiness. And if you think about a bishop, that he wasn't a bishop, but he would go to war and be a saint at the same time. So illustrating how in this context in which a very high, like also say, very aristocratic, say, background, the sense of one of these men that had been in some cases also considered this, being raised as would be knights, right? And that at some point had to have an ecclesiastical career for whichever dynastic reasons or opportunity would arise, or vice versa. Like there were some knights who were trained as, say, secular lords that would also be very involved in warfare, that had been, however, initially raised as like at least prepared for an ecclesiastical career, and even having entered that at some point, being projected instead in the world in a bigger sense. Bishops were actual secular clergy, they weren't exiles. They had to cope with the world and all those, say, material issues, like including, I don't know, providing for the defense of the communities, organizing town watches, in fact, carrying expeditions. Here, the reason why they were mostly militarized is that they traditionally were required since Carolingian times to, for reasons of responsibility and, say, effectiveness in the whole enterprise, to actually lead their troops until the military frontier. And then at that point, actually, if they wanted to have leave, then they would do it sometimes, but sometimes it would stay. And this is typical of especially of the Carolingian era, where you find also abbots that are, especially abbots, like men of war without any, say, with a completely secular life that wasn't even bothered to be seen as something different from, in fact, the one of a secular nobleman. And so we will, if anything, look better at this background, because it makes, in fact, everything much more contextual and less surprising. Because, as I said before, the 13th century may have been the peak of episcopal involvement when you look at the absolute level of forces, for example, commanded or mobilized by bishops, but in relative terms, actually, as far as every bishop, the average bishop was concerned, it was actually not the moment of greatest militarization, right? It would have been in the previous centuries, I suspect, something like between the 10th and the 11th century would have been way more typical. Here, we're looking mostly at ecclesiastical princes and also, like, the sense, less frequently involved prelates in the business of war. Otherwise, business of war per se, because even if they commanded armies that were at least responsible for, as we've seen, providing them and guiding them in a sense spiritually, it's not that they would necessarily be in command, would be terrific strategists or whatever. Like they would just, let's say, these troops would work for the bishop, and that's what would make the latter sort of very involved into the thing. But of course, this has all a set of shades. There is also the Battle of Steps, that is more like in a Flemish context. It was fought on October the 13th, 1213. We will see all these battles at some point. And essentially, this clash, so from one side, the Prince Bishop of Liège, together with the Count Louis of Lotz, and on the other side, the Duke of Brabant. These are the wars that we have seen, like, between these powers. They were trying to essentially knock each other out for the dominance on Flanders. Essentially, Brabant would emerge victorious. And in fact, the outcome here was very unfavorable to the Prince Bishop's men. The Brabançon infantry charged downhill while the Liégeois were advancing, and this impetuous attack, you see here what we were saying before, the Brabançon, this Flemish context, and you see infantry that charges downhill against a Prince Bishop army. We're talking here about 700 feudal cavalry fielded by him, and so there is some, of course, the Duke of Brabant was much of a feudal leader himself, but you could see in part that this contrast between different types also of secular political culture involved in these rivalries. Before, we were talking about the spiritual effect that the bishop would have on the battlefield. There was a lot of symbolism, as you know, in medieval tradition, and among this we can find, military-wise, documented German episcopal gonfalons. This would have been used by, say, bishops had they gone at war in every country. And we know this gonfalon. We will actually make a video probably about this. It was a sort of carroccio style, like a wagon with, the banner. This actual gonfalon on it. I made a video explaining the actual difference between these things, at least for the later Middle Ages. And it would show essentially how the bishop and archbishops, say, in question, would be on active service. especially as we've seen the entailed by the Episcopal Imperial connections. In fact, the source we get the gonfalon from dates to the 80s of the 12th century, and it is presented to a prelate. We don't know who he is in the image, but it's likely the Archbishop of Cologne, that, as we've seen, was quite active in this context at the moment of his investiture by Emperor Frederick I. Very important figure that covered the office of Archbishop of Cologne was Reinald of Dassel. We'll talk about him in some other context, but here, given the date, we could think of Philip von Heinsberg, that was not just Duke of Westphalia and Angria, but also in personal union from 1180, in fact, with the by incumbents of the Cologne See. And from he actually covered the office since 1167 and lasting until 1191. So that's possibilities, perhaps the greater possibility. Now, when you look at this gonfalon, you say, is there anything special about it? Well, really not. Like, it's not really different from the gonfalon of a baron, except that it is surmounted by a gilt cross, just like, I don't know, the helm, as we've seen, is surmounted by a mitre crest. And there are other illustrations, actually, sometimes showing a cross embroidered in addition on the gonfalon itself, which would be a further indicator of that ecclesiastical background. The importance here, of course, of such bishops is their loyalty to the emperor and their willingness, as we've seen, to lay down their own lives in combat as commanders, but also together with all the other risks involved that were really part of a knight's duty, more than a bishop, at least in this sense, but were lent, in fact, by the bishops themselves because simply of the, as we've seen, political necessity, the general background, and also the type of lifestyle that they enjoyed aside from this mission. All right. So I tried to insert a bit of different things that could help framing the question. I'm very interested actually about the prior times of this, because they are sort of more explicative. As we were saying before, this is not really the peak of the relative participations of bishops to war. There was a much cruder time in the past in which being a bishop was even more brutal. But definitely in 1122 there is a change that helps, from one side, elevating the figure of the bishops, or at least some bishops. These are also in a few generations, the centuries in which there is a bit of a lock of the higher nobility, right? So it's mostly about that we're looking, and not really all bishops would have been that militarized, nor it's not that they would have refused the fight had they found themselves in specific circumstances, but that was still not seen as their primary mansion. So this was just more like an accident rather than a higher vocation, right? And I think that this makes overall sense. Excuse me, I drink a little, even though I finished the video. There's always surely a lot to add. We will hopefully do it in other videos, just about medieval bishops in general. As I was saying before, you have the playlist you can always check out. I will insert this video there. The moment, of course, in which you'll see it is likely already there. And here, 8 videos. It's not that much, to tell you the truth. But it's important, like, to cultivate this sense of the medieval episcopate, because the role of bishops is so central, also in a truly secular sense. I think lay is a better term than secular, because technically bishops are secular clergy. All right, and they are historically just the most involved, in fact, in secular affairs. They have very sort of even civic, public culture of sort, and many of their communities look up to and for them, just like for all the, also as we've seen, the defense, the protection, which definitely came in arms. Otherwise, we will also look at, of course, medieval knightly panoply also this time, because there's a lot of interesting things going on, and about, say, German warfare, broader context surrounding this wall. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.